The International Conference of Governance, Security and Justice Statistics is organized by the National Institute of Statistics and Geography, INEGI, and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. The first edition gathered more than 400 people interested in security and justice statistics. The second conference addressed the challenges and opportunities for developing crime and criminal justice statistical systems. The third conference topic was the 2030 Agenda and the indicators for measuring the Sustainable Development Goals. The fourth edition discussed the importance of standards and classifications. COVID-19 prevented the fifth face-to-face conference organization in 2020, but today we invite you to participate virtually. Join us to learn about the impacts of the pandemic on security and justice statistics. Sign up and participate.
Muy buenos días, tardes o noches tengan todos y todas. Mi nombre es José María Izábal y hoy seré su anfitrión. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas al segundo día de la quinta Conferencia Internacional sobre Estadísticas de Gobernanza, Seguridad y Justicia, especialmente a la sesión Retos de los Datos sobre Delincuencia en Asia y el Pacífico. Les recuerdo que esta sesión será grabada y les invitamos a usar la sección de preguntas y respuestas. Las intervenciones de este día se realizarán en inglés, por lo que les invitamos a elegir el idioma de traducción, español y portugués, en la función de interpretación localizado en el menú inferior derecho. Como moderadora de esta sesión, nos acompaña la señora Hyun Jung Park, coordinadora del Centro de Excelencia para Información Estadística sobre el Delito y la Justicia Penal en Asia y el Pacífico. Muchas gracias por su atención, bienvenidos, y le cedo la palabra a la señora Hyun Jung Park. Welcome, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Jose. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us, especially the distinguished panelists. It is my great honor to host as a moderator. My name is Hyun Jung Park, and I'm the coordinator of the Center of Excellence for Statistics on Crime and Criminal Justice in Asia and the Pacific, also known as the COE. Before I introduce the speakers, let me start by introducing the COE. High-quality statistical information is the foundation of the decision-making process for supporting all sectors of society. Due to dynamic, diverse crime and its impact on society and the economy, one of the most urgent mandates for criminal justice systems is to produce accurate, transparent, comparable, and methodologically sound data that can be shared at the national level for evidence-based policymaking. The problem is that criminal justice systems are complex. Many agencies involved use different terminology, standards, and classifications. One of the biggest challenges is that some national authorities do not want to share data with each other. In addition, not all crimes are recorded. The crimes that are not reported or observed are so-called dark figures. To find the dark figure, we need to collect data using victimization surveys and corruption surveys to ensure the reality of crime is understood and responded to effectively. But without data, countries cannot understand crime trend and patterns, cannot evaluate policies, cannot conduct analysis, and cannot develop innovative methods such as crime prediction. As you may know, Asia and the Pacific are composed of 56 member states and associate members with many languages, cultures, stages of economic development, and significant crime challenges. 3 of these will be addressed in this session. In 2018, UNODC reported Asia and the Pacific has nearly 60% more convictions for trafficking in persons than the rest of the world combined. Also in the region, prison overcrowding, a high number of unsentenced detainees, opaque, unjust, and unrepresentative criminal justice systems undermine rule of law. Additionally, corruption underpins effort against transnational organized crime, free and fair governance, and directly impacting the integrity of the state. To respond to these crime data challenges, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has partnered with Statistics Korea and established the Center of Excellence serving the Asia-Pacific region in 2019. In the 2 years since opening and modeled on its successful partner, the UNODC-INEGI Center of Excellence, our co-host for this conference, the Asia-Pacific COE gives technical assistance to member states to build capacity of crime and criminal justice statistics to measure and respond to crime. The COE is the regional innovation hub for the exchange of knowledge, experience, and information between stakeholders involved in national crime statistics system, including National Statistical Office, law enforcement, prosecutors, courts, prison, relevant line ministries, and other relevant external entities. Particular focus of the COE is given to implementing the international classification of crime for statistical purposes, crime victimization surveys, corruption surveys, increasing the availability and quality of data provided to the UN Crime Trend Survey, and supporting the production of data indicators required to monitor relevant sustainable development goals. This session brings together experts from the 3 most urgent issues to analyze corruption, trafficking in persons, and the effectiveness of criminal justice systems. We will hear from our speakers about data availability amid limited prioritization of crime and criminal justice statistics. To respond to these challenges and identify best practice for evidence-based policymaking, I'm sure this is going to be a particularly enlightening and informative session. We will be very grateful to our speakers, Dr. Marika McAdam, Professor Raymund in Narag, and Professor Kilkon for taking the time to join this session. Thank you. So let's start with the first speaker, Dr. McAdam, focusing on trafficking in persons. Dr. Marika McAdam is an independent legal consultant, scholar, and advisor. So this is my first question. Some of our audience may be unfamiliar with trafficking in persons. What is trafficking in persons, and what is the difference between smuggling of migrants and trafficking in persons?
Thank you very much, Ms. Park, for that question. And it's a good one. It's one that comes up time and time again, notwithstanding that we have had international law on both of these for 20 years now. Essentially, trafficking and smuggling are different crime types, and they're captured in 2 different instruments, which means they have different definitions. So trafficking is a 3-element crime. It involves an act by a means for a purpose. Smuggling, on the other hand, is just a 2-element crime requiring an act and a purpose. Now, in lay terms, just to take it out of the legal space, trafficking is essentially the process of putting a person into a situation of exploitation by illicit means, whereas smuggling is the process of profiting from facilitating another person's irregular migration. So the key feature of smuggling is the criminal intention of profits, whereas for trafficking, the key purpose is the intention to exploit. Now, there's some complexities here, of course, and at the national level, those definitions may differ somewhat, and some other distinctions relate as well. Smuggling is always a transnational crime. It always involves a border crossing. Trafficking can happen just in one country. But the two crime types intersect in complex ways. Very often the object of the crime, so whether the victim being trafficked or the migrant being smuggled, very often they're vulnerable people who may both have protection needs. And a result of this is that they can be difficult to differentiate in practice, particularly given that a person can begin as a smuggled migrant and then subsequently be trafficked. And smuggled migrants too, we know, are very vulnerable to being trafficked, particularly where they pay for their smuggling fees through debts. Where that manifests as debt bondage, the result can be incredibly high vulnerability to being trafficked. So whether a situation is one or the other depends on the chain of criminal actors involved and their intentions. And another key point to emphasize here too is this notion of harm. Very often there is an assumption that victims of trafficking suffer harm and smuggled migrants do not. But we know that the things are not so black and white. Victims of trafficking don't always suffer extreme harm, whereas sometimes smuggled migrants do. And for this reason, there's been increased emphasis in recent years on aggravated forms of smuggling, where, for instance, smuggled migrants are subject to violence and their lives are put in danger, as we see reported in the media all the time. So those are some of the key differences. So in short, distinct crime types, but they intersect in very complex ways.
Thank you. Excellent response. The next one is, there are different motivations for trafficking persons: sexual exploitation, forced labor, forced begging, and organ removal. What are the most prevalent trafficking person issues in Asia and the Pacific? And what are the impact on victims?
Another big question there. Look, according to the most comprehensive data that we have, which is from UNODC's recent global trafficking report from 2020, we know that the most prevalent type in East Asia and the Pacific is sexual exploitation, which accounts for about 64% of it, followed by 29% for forced labor, and then other forms is the remaining 7%. Can you just mute your microphone, Ms. Park? Thank you. So in terms of the profiles of people, we know that women account for most of those victims of sexual exploitation, whereas men are the most victimized by forced labor. So the victims, though, taken as a whole, irrespective of the form of exploitation, most of them in Southeast Asia are women, but that also correlates with the fact that most of the cases identified are for trafficking for sexual exploitation. So about 48% are women, followed by 21% men, followed by boys and girls. However, there are significant limitations and gaps in this data that we have to interrogate, and there is a significant margin for error at each point of data collection, including different understandings of these points, of these types of exploitation that you've asked about, Ms. Park, and you speak to some specific forms, forced begging, for instance, and this, I think, really showcases how difficult some of this data is to get at. Forced begging may be in some jurisdictions captured distinctly as forced begging, or it may be captured as trafficking for the purpose of forced criminality, if forced begging is a crime type, or it may be a form of forced labor, or it may be trafficking for the purpose of forced labor. So that gives you an idea of just how difficult it is to correlate all of this data. Similarly, for trafficking for the purpose of organ removal, some countries will criminalize that and approach it as trafficking for the purpose of organ removal. But in other cases, there is a limited understanding of that. So they may address it rather as a type of simply organ trafficking and not make a distinction between those two crime types. And then other complexities arise with things like trafficking for forced marriage. At what point does an exploitative or a bad marriage become trafficking for the purpose of forced marriage? So this gives you some indication of the complexities of these complex and the data that relates to it. And you speak, Ms. Park, to the question of harms. Here, it's impossible to generalize. And I think the key point to be made about harm on victims is that we can't make assumptions about the harm that a victim suffers on the basis of the type of exploitation. Now, very often there is an assumption that sexual exploitation as a purpose of trafficking is the worst and it always falls at the higher end of harm. And extreme cases, indeed, it does. We have victims who suffer from rape and forced pregnancy, forced abortion, suffer from STIs and other health issues. But for other victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation, the consequence of being rescued may be worse than the harm they suffered during their exploitation. And other forms of exploitation are very often overlooked, such as trafficking into forced labor, where, for instance, if we take the fishing industry, we have victims who are exploited at sea for months and sometimes years and not returned to land in this time, which is unimaginable harm. Some of them are also sexually assaulted, physically assaulted, tortured in order to extract their work, forced to take drugs. And victims of trafficking very rarely receive justice. So again, a key point on harm is that the dramatic depictions of what we see in the media and on TV don't necessarily paint the nuanced picture that is the reality. And regardless of the form of exploitation, all victims are entitled to protections on the basis of having been trafficked.
Thank you for detailed. Thank you for detailed example. Yeah. The third one is to improve evidence-based policymaking. What steps have countries taken and could they take to improve data quality for trafficking in persons?
Yeah, so I think generally it's fair to say that there's been some good progress made in recent years with widespread acceptance of the international definition of trafficking in persons and indeed smuggling of migrants. And that's resulted in an increased agreement about what it is we're collecting data on. Still, of course, though, challenges remain, and states understand the components of what constitute these crime types in very different ways, and therefore they disaggregate the data in very different ways. So I think good practice then is to build capacity on what these forms of trafficking look like, and to make sure that data on traffickers and on victims and smugglers and smuggled migrants is disaggregated in similar ways, capturing things like age and gender, nationality, ethnicity, not just of victims, but also of perpetrators of these crime types. And importantly too, as I suggested at the outset, we need to really interrogate the assumptions that we make about this data. For instance, in our region, in East Asia and the Pacific, we know that trafficking of women and girls for sexual exploitation is the most widely reported in the Asia Pacific. But what does that mean? Does it mean that trafficking of women and girls for sexual exploitation is more prevalent, or just that we're looking for that data? Is there potentially some gender bias going on there in terms of acceptance of female victimhood and a lack of understanding of male victimhood? Is there perhaps a focus on sexual forms over non-sexual forms of exploitation? And indeed, does this speak to some sort of cultural and social aversion to some sectors of exploitation, such as the sex industry, and an acceptance of exploitation where it takes place in other contexts? So I think we need to ask how the data is being interpreted and what we can do with it. And indeed, we need to, question in some of the impact of this data. You know, some of the most significant change, I think, has resulted from things like the United States Trafficking in Persons report that has a tier ranking system, and that has created a lot of change in response. And that's a very useful one, but is the change made because of a state's own decisions or because of the agendas of another state? Similarly, there was significant response to trafficking in the fishing industry as a result of the European Union's illegal, unreported, unregulated carding system. Now, the dire consequences of exploitation in the fishing industry really came to light then, and they resulted in significant change, such as Thailand, you know, signing up to ILO agreements on labor in the fishing industry and principles and guidelines on businesses and human rights. And indeed, Thailand became the first country in Asia to ratify the ILO Work and Fishing Convention. So these are all significant changes, but I think a question we need to ask is this evidence-based policy or is it politics-based policy? Does the data result in change, or does the way we convey and disseminate this data and talk about it, is that what the change is? So I think countries in this region really need to take proactive steps to empower themselves with data, so they're not relying always on external data. They also need to look for data that challenges the status quo and doesn't just confirm it. And those collecting the data, I think, need to work better at making what they do, their research, more accessible. So it's in the languages of this region. So it's written in ways that people here can access, because so much great academic research is done, but is inaccessible. And I think policymakers, finally, need to strive towards and be called into account for the extent to which their policies are evidence-based.
Dr. McAdam, we just have 3 minutes, so please, yeah, speedily. The other one is trafficking in person is cross-cutting issue at the subnational, national, regional, and global levels, requiring the engagement of the multitude of stakeholders and significant condition. What successful outcomes have there been in stakeholder engagement using data, and how could they better engage in this field?
2-minute response for you, Ms. Park.
Yeah.
I don't want to give UNODC credit just because they're hosting this event, but I think the UNODC Global Report really is a great offering. It's one of the most comprehensive things that we have. Some limitations to it, of course, but it is a great resource. The Counter Trafficking Data Collective by IOM is also offering some harmonized data and a methodology that is really cross-disciplinary. So I think those are great examples, and a lot of effort is going on to create that. In terms of what could be done better, I think there is an urgent need to reconcile approaches across stakeholders. And we need then to really ask, how do we strengthen criminal justice data? Currently, this emphasis on victims needs to be met with an emphasis too on understanding traffickers. We need to figure out how we understand migration, labor, human rights, vulnerability, and package that into a meaningful picture of counter trafficking. And ultimately, I think we need a more nuanced approach that's not just quantitative, but is also qualitative, so that response to trafficking can actually be policy-based. And so we're not just collecting data for the sake of collecting data. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McAdam. So let's start with the second speaker, Professor Raymund E. Narag, focusing on criminal justice system in Asia and the Pacific. Dr. Narag is an associate professor and a George William Cook Professor Fellow in Southern Illinois University. The first one is, globally, there are many challenges in the criminal justice system in Asia and the Pacific. While recognizing the gravity of this question broadly, what are the most pressing issues and how can they be addressed?
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Park, for that very interesting question. Indeed, while there are many challenges in the criminal justice in Asia and the Pacific, I consider two most pressing problems to be: one is the prevalence and use of pretrial detention, and second one would be jail and prison overcrowding. And I could just show some screen here. So as you would see here, this is the prevalence of pretrial detention in some of the countries in the Asia and the Pacific. And most countries, for example, have more than 50% of their prison population to be pretrial detainees. And so this is just a huge problems affecting us. And in some countries, it's even 2/3 of their prison population. And this is compounded by the problem of prolonged pretrial, where they stay in jail while undergoing trial, and they are still presumed innocent. It could be 5 years, 10 years. And in one study that I've done in the Philippines, there are people who have stayed in jail for 20 years undergoing trial, presumed innocent. And there are numerous reasons for this. One would be the lack of alternatives to pretrial detention. People are not released on supervised release supervision while undergoing trial. There's no pretrial release, for example. And the other one will be the massive arrest of drug users, especially the Philippines and Thailand and many other countries that have looked at the drug problem. Still, in many countries in Asia and the Pacific, arrest and detention has been the first resort, not the last resort. Financial bail are usually the options, but since many of these individuals entangled with the criminal justice system are indigent, they could not post bail. And so that's a two problem. They are in detention while undergoing trial, and it's very long trial process. So what happens now is that many people plead guilty, right, for a lesser offense, just so they would be released. And so this makes them prisoners who were never convicted to convicts who had never been tried. And that had been a mantra now in United Nations circles, that we have to look at into these problems. The second problem is very related to this, and that's prison overcrowding and jail overcrowding. And as you would see here, some of the occupancy levels in Asia, the Philippines, especially where I do most of my research, are almost more than 460% over congestion. So a person, a cell designed for 20 people, there could be as many as 40 people in it, right? Because that's the level of congestion. And again, there are many reasons for this. One is the lack of non-custodial measures. The second would be the drug war and the policies on arrest on drug users. And then, of course, the inefficient court systems in many countries, where it takes a while for them to decide whether they are innocent or not. So the solutions for me, and this is ongoing also based on my research in the Philippines, that it could be three-pronged. One would be structural, two will be organizational, and three will be cultural. Structural will be, of course, we need to have more resources put into the criminal justice system, better facilities for jails and prisons, better facilities for court systems, or more individuals because they are overworked, because there are very few people being employed. So that would be a structural solution. Of course, that's not it, because even if you have all of these structural conditions, if the organizational systems are not in place, for example, police officers do not know effectively how to do proper arrest or proper investigation, or the courts do not have mechanisms for proper docket management, or the jails and prisons don't know how to implement effective correctional management. So we need to have also organizational change. We will be in forms of technical assistance. And then finally would be cultural change, changing the mindset. The mindset right now is, of course, detention and incarceration, right? That's the first, arrest them, put them in prison, and that's it, leave them there. Lack of rehabilitation. So that's a changing of mindset mechanism as well. Also, of course, as mentioned a while ago by Marika, is to challenge the prevalence of corruption in the criminal justice system. How police use their power in such a way that they make money out of it, for example, is a key issue. police misconduct, also jail and prison misconduct in prison. So all of these are key things that we need to do in order to address one, preventive detention and pretrial detention, and two, jail and prison overcrowding.
For explanation. Next one is in terms of interagency cooperation across the different institutions and agencies of the criminal justice system. What are the biggest challenges? Crime definition, standardization, limited dialogue, limited data linkage system.
Thank you very much. And that's also a very tough question. And I do believe the three things that you have listed there are the emerging problems in the criminal justice system in the Asia and the Pacific. As mentioned by Marika earlier in her outstanding discussions, there's limited crime definition standardization. Many countries do not have, of course, a working definition at the national level on, say, what's trafficking in persons or what's drug trafficking, even domestic violence. And even within the countries itself, the agencies may have different definitions too. So the police may define domestic violence in such a way that's different from the prosecutor, that's different from the courts. And when they are classified in jail and prisons, there's also a working definition that's different. And not only definition, there's also different ways of data recording and data reporting, right, from these different agencies. So the number one step now is to come up with these standardizations of definitions, reportings, and mechanisms. And the ICCS of the UNODC had been very helpful in introducing this first step. The second step, the second problem, of course, is limited dialogue. The criminal agencies are working in silos. The police, they have their own worlds, and they rarely share their information with, say, prosecutors and police and prisons and jails, for example. One problem that I could think of in the Philippines is the gang problem, right? Gangs is a problem faced by the jails and faced by the prisons. But in the Philippines, jails and prisons are managed by two different agencies, and they have different systems of dealing with gangs. One formally recognizes it, one suppresses it, but they are within the system. So they do not talk among themselves on how to deal with jail and prison gangs. The third is, of course, the limited data linkage. In the Philippines and many other countries in Asia Pacific, the police would collect the data, but usually sometimes it's pen and paper. It's not yet digitized, right? Or if they are digitized, they are not shared by the next agency in the criminal justice system. So when the person is transferred to the jail, the information collected by the police are not shared to the jail agencies. And the data collected in the jail agencies are not transferred to the probation and parole or to the prison agencies, and so on and so forth. And so it's like starting again anew each time a person is transferred from one agency to the next. So that's the third problem. And in the Philippines, that I've been looking at, is they have introduced the single carpeta system. The idea that the data that collected by the police, the jails and prisons should be shared in one cloud system so that there will be efficient sharing of information. Unfortunately, they started that in 2013, and it's already 8 years hence, and they are still in the process of pilot testing. And in many countries in Asia and the Pacific, they are still on these initial stages as well.
Thank you. What kind of data be collected during the process of criminal justice system with specific reference to data linkage systems and regional surveys? How can this data be effectively used?
That's a very interesting question. And this goes now to the notion of evidence-based criminal justice practices. So the first thing here is that we need to know who are the people who are our clients in the criminal justice system, so that we could focus our programs and our supervision. And in here, the emerging key concept right now would be the notion of criminogenic risk and needs assessment, that you would know what are the factors related to their offending, And then you would know their risk factors for future reoffending. And this could be used by the jail in order to determine their program offerings in the jail, and also levels of supervision, where you put them in minimum security, medium security, or maximum security. This could also be used by judges and prosecutors. As I've mentioned a while, the number one problem is pre-trial detention. And that's because so many people could not afford to post bail, and also because of lack of alternatives to pre-trial detention. But using criminogenic risk assessments, you could now identify who are the individuals who have low risk, who could be released while undergoing trial. So for example, the first-time offenders, those who are working, those who have strong family ties, those who have good community ties, but they were charged of an offense, right? So in the present system, if they could not post bail, they will rot in jail while undergoing trial. But if you have the criminogenic risk assessments and public safety assessments, then you could identify who are these low-risk pre-trial detainees who could be released on their own recognizance. They would be supervised, but they will be still undergoing trial. So I do believe that could be the data that could really inform the criminal justice system. And in my efforts in the Philippines as well in other Asian countries, we have been introducing this to the jail officers, that they should have criminogenic risk assessments to understand the level of risk posed by their detainees. And then they transfer this data to the prisons when they are convicted, and prisons would do their own assessments as well. And then they would share this with the parole and probation offices, and so on and so forth. And so you could really build a database wherein you would know what are the risk levels, so that you would know what programs to offer and what level of supervision to provide them. And that could be very helpful in evidence-based decision-making.
Yeah, you raised some important ideas. Thank you. The last question is, what impact does this data have on policymakers? How can data be better utilized?
Yes, there are now growing realization among criminal justice actors in the Asia and the Pacific for the need for data collection. They are now introducing mechanisms like the standardized crime definitions proposed by UNODC, and they have been training jail officers, prison officers, police officers on how to use these uniform and standardized data collection, data reporting, and data recording. Unfortunately, and this is the bigger problem, is that many of these data and studies that come out of the data are usually very difficult to be introduced to the policymakers. There's still this notion of penal populism, that it's better to just put them in jail and let them rot. And I'm talking here about, of course, the drug problems. So many efforts have shown that incarceration does not work for drug users. It's better to treat them in the community. And there have been data that supports this. Unfortunately, in many countries in Southeast Asia right now, the popular appeal of incarceration is still very strong. And with this, social and political atmosphere that we have, the information that we collected are very difficult to be introduced and to enmesh with the policy making processes that we have. So we still have a lot of work to do in the Asia Pacific.
Thank you for response. Now we move to another speaker. Let's start with last speaker, Professor Kilkon Ko, focusing on corruption in Asia and the Pacific. Dr. Kilkon Ko is Professor of Graduate School of Public Administration, Seoul National University. My first question is to introduce the topic. How prevalent is corruption in Asia and the Pacific? And which specific offenses are most prevalent? Active, passive bribery of public officers, trading in influence, obstruction of justice, etc. Please. Dr. Go, please turn on your microphone.
Can you hear me
Oh, yeah.
now?
Yeah, can hear me.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you very much for your questions. Regarding the types of corruption, there are many types of corruption in Asia, but it is very difficult to pinpoint what types of the corruption is more serious. But overall, let's start from the corruption in public sectors. In public sectors, there are different kinds of the corruption, but when we say the corruption in public sector, we usually distinguish the political corruption with the administrative corruptions. Political corruption is done by the politician who want to hold the political power. Usually they want to purchase the vote from the citizens. And this kinds of political corruption is also related to the black money. So the black money related to the politics require the bribery systems, and this bribery system affect the embezzlement and other types of the corruption. So the chain of these kinds of the corruption happens within this political corruption. And administrative corruption is misuse of the public funds, for example, embezzlement of the budget or the wrongly allocating the public money for the personal interest and so forth. So that types of the administrative corruption is also found. And we also mentioned the petty corruption, which is like taking some small amount of money by the police or some administrators to expedite the public service. So that kinds of the petty corruption also found in the administrative procedures. Beside that, we should not underestimate the private sector corruptions. The reason is the private sector corruption is very rampant, but unfortunately, we only focus on the public corruption. So this unbiased attention incurred the rampant of the private corruption in the private sectors. So we need to balance between this public and the private corruption, especially in the developed countries like South Korea. The South Korean government did a lot of works to minimize the public corruption, but unfortunately, the corruption observed in private sector is not well controlled by the government. So in future, we need to balance we also have to take care of this private corruption. And finally, I want to emphasize the localized corruption. For example, have we heard the ghost teachers? These ghost teachers are found in the Bangladesh or the Pakistan. These teachers are enlisted in the payroll, but they actually did not teach at all. So they just take the salary, but they did not provide the service for the students. So those kinds of the ghost teachers are very serious problem in the Bangladesh or the Pakistan. And in Myanmar, there are some corruption related to the timber industries. And in Philippines, there are very serious political corruption related to the nepotisms. So each country has its own localized type of the corruptions. Okay.
Extremely interesting subjects. Thank you. Next one is, while recognizing the diversity of the region, what are the impact of corruption at the individual, community, and the national levels?
Okay, thank you very much for the second question as well. This is very difficult to explain the impact of the corruption at individual, community, and national level, because all are intertwined actually. However, at the individual level, this is very serious because this undermines more ethical standard of the people. And this these ethical issues also affect the community level corruptions and also affect the national level. But the individual level corruptions impacts of the corruption also the result in distrust in government. The distrust in governments is very serious challenge to the many public administration in the world. And the community level corruption, this is very tricky because the community itself always distinguish insider with the outsider. So the integrate interest could be the community interest. And this community interest can also be a corruption. So the inside-outside problem result in the very the serious segregation problem between the within and the outside of the community. And finally, the national level, the impacts of the corruption, definitely I think the worst impact of the corruption at the national level is the undermining of the democracy. The political system, rule of law game, is totally distorted. So this undermines the institution, the political system, eventually our democracy. And some people may emphasize that there is negative economic impact of the corruption. Yeah, definitely there is the negative economic impacts. But beside this, nowadays, especially in Asian countries, the negative impact on the ODA is also the problem. The developed countries concern the corruption in the developing countries, so they hesitate to donate their money to the corrupt countries. So this also negatively affect the ODA in the developing country in Asia as well. Okay.
Thank you. The third question is, considering traditional surveys, experience and perception, and the use of new technologies, how effective is each modality in understanding corruption? And what are your predictions for data collection in the future?
Okay. Yes, this is very challenging issues because when we say the new technology, this technologies, new technology actually the different across the countries. However, if we look at the traditional survey method, it has a lot of the limitations, especially the limitation of the perception survey. And when we also apply the survey to measure the experience, people hesitate to tell the truth to the interviewers. So always we suffer from the validity of the traditional survey method. Then how can we overcome these kinds of problems? I want to emphasize the multi-dimensional approaches. For example, in South Korea, every year the police department and the prosecuted officers release their statistic of the punishment of public officials related to the corruptions. And also the government released the punishment status, internal punishment statistics of the public officials. And also that we can utilize a newspaper article counting the number of any articles related to the corruptions. And we also apply for the nationwide survey. For example, in Korea, every year, not only the department or the local government, but also public institutions have to take the national level survey to measure the corruption. So there are many ways to measure the corruption. But important thing is not just the measurement itself, how we transparently share this information. That is more important. So if we have the multidimensional data collected by the survey, collected by the text analysis or the official statistic, if we are available, if we are able to use this multidimensional numbers, then we can correctly assess the situation of the corruption level of the country. So the good, well-established the survey method and the other technique, as well as the good communication skill, are, I think, the necessary for the better utilizing of the corruption measures.
You made some excellent points. Thank you. The first question is, with reference to data availability, how much significance do countries give to data collection to better learn and understand the modalities and impact of corruption?
Okay. Well, let me share the some experience of the South Korea and the Singapore. The first, in 2000, the South Korean government tried to start anti-corruption policy in a very comprehensive way, but people simply understood at the time that the corruption is a very serious problem. But people didn't know how these new anti-corruption policies affect the level of the corruption. So government wanted to measure the effectiveness of the anti-corruption policies. To do that, they start the nationwide level of anti-corruption, that's the corruption nationwide integrity measures. And by doing so, the government tried to share this information with the citizens. This requires high cost. Every year, they have to select the random sample and they have to analyze the data. And to do that, the government spends less of the money. And people actually do not trust much their government data. So to overcome this problem, the independent research institute also start to measure the corruptions. And also the academics, like professors in the universities, try to measure the corruption as well. So society as a whole spent lots of money to measure the corruptions. However, the reward is worthwhile to mention. Since this kind of measurement has been done over almost 2 decades, so we are able to check it out, the trend of the corruption. For example, here is very interesting things. In the 2000s, we asked the people how many people actually had the experience to give the bribe to the public official. At the time, around the 15 to the 20% of the respondents said yes. But as of the 2020, the ratio dropped to less than 1%. And people realize that, okay, the South Korean, the corruption problem is not anymore this kinds of bribe giving or the bribe taking issues. We realize different types of corruption is the problem in South Korea. So if we are able to systematically measure these kinds of corruption, then we can develop the better policies. In that sense, I want to support the investment for the measuring the corruptions. And there are many different the modes of the measuring the corruption. Nowadays, we can use the internet survey. Now also there are many systematic monitoring systems. So that we can utilize these kinds of the advanced information communication technology to measure the corruptions. Okay, yeah.
Thank you for sharing your experience. The last question is, to end on a positive note, what are some evidence-based policies and outcomes being undertaken in the region which are working effectively for the prevention of corruption?
Yeah, this must be, I think, the most crucial issues. Right. Well, the Singapore, as I mentioned, Singapore is a very good this example. The Singapore every year the release, the CPIB, the always everyday release is the corruption status report, and within the regions. The PERC, which is located in the Hong Kong, that company also measure the corruption and share the information. Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index and the International Crime Victimization Survey. There are many kinds of the survey available to measure the corruption. And these kinds of the survey results are also used to design the anti-corruption policies. However, these international statistics have some flaw because it is not directly usable for each country. That's the reason that we needed to develop the domestic level, the each country level, the anti-corruption measure, which also can be used for developing anti-corruption policies. In that regards, we have to set up some little bit the systematic approach. For example, every year, the CPI, the Transparency International actually measure the corruption, but they did not talk much about what kinds of policy tools are more effective to control the corruptions. So policy orientation is not much designed within the CPI of the Transparency International. So to do that, so we may utilize the ADB, Asia Development Bank, or we build up some academic networks to develop the survey to figure it out what kinds of the anti-corruption policy would be more effective than others. So that kinds of international efforts to design the better policymaking tools based on the evidence would be, I think, the necessary. And within the domestic the situation, I think the government should ask the simple question: why do we measure the corruption? Unfortunately, many governments just measure the level of the corruption, and that's it. They did not ask the simple question: how they utilize this information for what? So each country should develop its own survey or any kinds of measurement to fix the specific problem. For example, in South Korea, we have very serious problem of the integrity issues. Integrity here is not about the embezzlement or the bribery. The people, the really concerned, the fairness. The violation of fairness is considered as the corruption in Korea. So more and more, the Korean government tries to measure the fairness as a part of the corruption, like that. So we can develop that kinds of the localized survey design. And also the policy tools comes from the different ways. For example, we may rely on the legal tools, or we utilize the advanced accounting system, or we try to design the more holistic approach. There are many ways to control the corruption. And to do that, we need different kinds of solutions to find out the better solutions. So my point is the international and the domestic efforts are necessary, but those efforts should be directed to solve the problem, not just the measurement per se. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your insight. Now we are going to move on the group discussion. As a reminder, you can still submit questions. In the chat box, I have several questions for Marika, Dr. McAdam, and Dr. Narag, and Dr. Go. For the first question, Marika, we have had a question. The question is, what you mean when you say the consequence of the ransom may be worse than the damages suffering by victims of trafficking? Could you please answer?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, it's a big one. What I mean by that is that trafficking is a very broadly framed crime. So some people who are captured as victims of trafficking are in situations that they have actively sought out. They may not be ideal situations, but they may be gaining some benefit, whether it's some income that they're able to remit to their families or an improved situation than the one before. This doesn't suggest that the situation they are in is acceptable or non-criminal, but it speaks to their experience of it. And then on the other side, what we often have in many countries around the world, but including in this region, is a situation where a victim is identified, and then they may be provided with services that they don't consent to and they don't want. That can look like, for instance, being put into shelters that are closed shelters that they're not able to leave. Sometimes they are there for their own protection. Sometimes they are there in order to participate in criminal justice processes. So they can be there for indefinite periods, sometimes of many months, sometimes even longer. And in that time, they may not have the freedom to work, which means that they don't have an income, which means they cannot remit anything to their family. And so many victims speak of feeling in the post-trafficking phase a situation that is akin to what they experienced before. And for this reason, we have practitioners speaking about victims wanting to flee from the protection phase in order to return to the situation before it. So that's a very simplified look at the complexity between how we understand trafficking and the impact on victims of trafficking, and also our approach to counter trafficking and to victim protection. Thanks for the great question.
Thank you. The next question for Dr. Narag. Which are the most relevant and reliable data collection methods to understand prison overcrowding and prison population?
Yes, there's a couple of issues with regards to estimating prison crowding and prison population. For example, even the definition of prison crowding, what does that mean? For example, in the United States, if there's 100 bed capacity and there's 100 inmates, that would be almost full to the brim, and that's overcrowded already. Why? Because there are 100 inmates in a 100 bed capacity prison. In the Philippines, if there's 100 beds and there's 100 inmates, that would be an ideal situation. Why? Because everyone has a bed, right? However, if there will be 200 inmates and that was 100 bed, right? They consider that as overcrowding, 100% overcrowded, because there are 200 people in 100 bed capacity. And so there you go, right? How would you define overcrowding will be different from the perspectives of each of these countries that have different cultural, political, administrative, economic capabilities. Now, the second problem here is estimating the number of people inside jails and prisons. If the jail and prisons do not have a mechanism to actually collect all the inmates incoming, right? They would not even know how many prisoners are in that jail and prisons. And I visited some countries already in Asia Pacific and look onto their jails and ask the warden, so how many total inmates are here right now? And they would start guessing. Oh, probably it's around 300 or probably it's 1,000. It depends, because they did not have done the latest head count, right? And it's very anecdotal because they do not have a registry of sorts that are updated automatically on real time. So that's the second problem. The third problem will be some are very afraid to share the information, because if they share the information, it looks as if it's a black eye on their part. Oh, we have the most congested prison system in the world. We are the now number one because we have 550%. And so what they would do is to massage the data, right? Tweak some changes in the definition to make it appear that, wait a minute, our congestion rate is only around 150%, not 500%. And that has been a common practice solution in many countries in order to, avoid embarrassments of sort. So what we need to do is to avoid comparing prison systems and making the label that these are worst offenders in the prison data collection mechanism. Rather, there should be an honest to goodness effort to simply lay the facts, what are the data, and then use the data to support them and not to humiliate them, so that more people would be willing to share the information openly and share accurate information.
Thank you. The third one is for Professor Ko. Which corruption types are more prevalent in private and public sectors, please? And what example policies have been applied to reduce corruption?
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, good. Well, Well, as I mentioned before, it is difficult to pinpoint which corruption type is more serious, but usually the corruption in developing country is related to the bribery and the vote buying. Two are, I think, the most serious problem. Bribery, money-related the corruption, also has the different form. Sometimes we call this the kickbacks, the giving some money to as the exchange of the business contract, and the buying the public service by giving the money to the public officials. So this money-related corruption is the most serious observed both in private and public sectors, but especially in public sector, the serious issue is the vote buying, because some corrupt politicians repeatedly elected. This is very puzzling thing and complex things. Why do we select these corrupt politicians? I think this is related to the bad practice of the vote buying. Yes.
Thank you. The next one is for Marika. Should traffickers who themselves were once trafficking victims be prosecuted? If yes, how can legislators take a balanced approach in legal action?
What a fantastic and timely question. Thank you for that. I happen to be researching the issue of non-punishment in this region and how it plays out in practice. Look, there's not a simple answer to that, but I think some considerations that are important. First of all, the non-punishment principle is well protected in the ASEAN Convention, but also in the European Convention, also in the Organization of American States that recognize this principle. How that plays out in practice is different. And I think when you're talking about former victims who have become traffickers themselves, we need to back up from prosecution and say, well, is the non-punishment principle applicable before then, perhaps in the identification phase? Have we perhaps misidentified a victim of trafficking as a trafficker themselves, given that we know so many people graduate from one to the other? And I'll also note in this region, 61% of people who are investigated as traffickers are women. If that relates to sexual exploitation, are we perhaps misidentifying? And actually, we're looking at victims who shouldn't be arrested at all. But where there is an offense, where a person is committing a serious crime, including trafficking, then it may need to proceed to prosecution. And then there's a balance to be considered here. The principle still applies. What that looks like, it may look like the application of statutory defenses, and in some cases that requires consideration of coercion, which of course is a very strong one if the person was compelled to commit offense or did so under duress or necessity. But the broader interpretation of the principle is there a nexus between that offense and the commission of the crime? And then we weigh up the interests of the victim turned perpetrator and the victim of that perpetrator's offense. And I'll also refer to the fact that UNODC has just released a report on victims as defenders in the context of women and sexual exploitation, which I'd encourage you to look at. Great question and a timely one. Thank you.
Thank you. For Dr. Narag, considering the challenges for having integrated and comparable statistics, what are the challenges and strategies to improve data?
All right, I muted. Yeah, the first step really is to come up first with a common definition, as mentioned already by Marika earlier, of some of the key crimes that we want to investigate. And second is a training on how to record and how to report these data. And you would be amazed that while our criminal justice actors are doing this work day in, day out, they do not have the inclination to record it and document it properly. For example, again, in my work in the Philippines, for police officers, they would arrest people, they would detain them, they would put in jail. But there's no mechanism to actually collect the information for the victims and for the offenders of the crimes that they have investigated systematically. For example, simple information like age, gender, race, socioeconomic status, criminal background, etc. While some police stations would collect that information because they are required by law, face-to-face interview, they do not document it. They do not put it in a computer, for example. Even an Excel file will do, so that you have a database of sorts. And then if you could share that database in other police precincts, so that you now have a city level database, and then other cities would share that, and then now you have a provincial database, and then other provinces would share that until you have a national database, right? So that you will now have an idea how many domestic violence, how many trafficking of persons have been collected and documented in the past 5 years, or say 6 months, or say just this past 1 month or 1 week, right? So that you have real data, time data, in order to answer those basic questions. So the effort really is to go down to the field. And in my effort, I've been training jail guards, go to a jail and train them on how to collect the data. You know, simple, when were they committed in jail? What's the current date now? So that you would know their length of stay in detention. So that you would now have an aggregate of how many, what's the average length of stay of all 1,000 inmates in this particular jail. And then if you aggregate that, then you have a national data. What's the average length of stay of inmates in the Philippines or in Malaysia for this particular period? And so the effort really is to go down and introduce very simple data mechanisms, data management systems, train them on how to use it, and train them on how to properly analyze the data so that it could inform their policy, their practice, day in and day out. And then they become more evidence-based in their policy-making process.
Thank you. The next question is for Dr. Ho. What are the important tools to prevent corruption?
Well, you asked me to find out the magic stone, but well, if I recall my almost 40 years back time, at the time, many people actually paid the small money, the $10 to the police, not to get the traffic violation tickets. But in Korea, this practice doesn't exist anymore, almost zero. The reason is simple. Every kinds of the ticket issuing is done through the information communication technologies. So all activities of police is monitored through these kinds of the new technologies. So what is the characteristic of this new technology? I think it is about the transparency. So if administration system is well managed through the well-established information communication technologies, and the citizen can monitor activities of the administrators, then there is less room for the committing corruption. So transparency is the first thing, combined with the technology would provide the better solutions. And if I have a little bit more time, then I want to add a little bit more to the layman's the answers to this, developing the crime statistics. The South Korea actually has that kind of system. When the police start to investigate, then every activities of these police investigators is actually they saved within the government, the statistic systems, the crime investigation system of the Korean government. So Korea has very well established system. But unfortunately, this system is not well used because of the silo effect. So system is one on the one side issues. How we share this system and how we utilize system is the other issues. So we need to balance out these two. The system itself does not fix the problem. Yeah, thank you.
Point. Thank you. The next one is for Dr. McAdam. Are there any data available for the development of people trafficking and smuggling maps by region?
By region, yes. And again, I hate to sound like too much of a UNODC fangirl, but when it comes to a global picture that is broken down regionally, I think the most comprehensive report is that's coming out of UNODC. Now, the UNODC reports are divided into a trafficking picture and a smuggling picture. I think the strength of these reports is that it's based on official data. The weakness of these reports is that it's based on official data for all of the reasons that we're talking about. There's some significant limitations to that approach, but in terms of a comprehensive picture, I think it really does paint one. You're talking about both people trafficking and people smuggling though, and the two reports do stand separately, but I think they do offer a lot of value in both breaking down the regions, including ours, so including Asia and the Pacific, and then speaking to some extent about how those two phenomena, those two crime types happen trans-regionally. For both, most trafficking and smuggling is intra-regionally, but we are getting a stronger picture of where it occurs trans-regionally. And I think what's offered in those reports is quite insightful. So I would encourage you to have a look at both of them.
For another question for Dr. Park, Dr. Ko, are forms of corruption related to the education level of a country?
Yeah, corruption in the education field is very serious in many countries. One of typical example would be the corruption related to the admission to the university or admission to the good private schools in many countries. So, and so that is the big issues. But I don't know, when this kinds of education related corruption happens, that seriously undermines so-called meritocracy principle or fairness principle, because education itself is the primary tools for promoting the social class. So that's the reason that the corruption in education sector is really serious. So to overcome this problem, each country develops more transparent admission procedures, and they try to educate the teachers, and they try to persuade the parents not to violate the fairness rules. But unfortunately, this kind of effort is not satisfactory much. So if I revisit the Singapore case, in Singapore, all the record of the students, achievement of the students is released through released transparently through the computer system. So when the students start the first elementary school to the end of the high school, all the score achievement in the school is kinds of to be public information. So there is a little room for manipulating the personal the achievement. So I think that kinds of idea could be considerable. And the other thing is the university level efforts. The many universities, they try to take some donations from the parents in exchange for giving the admissions. That might be the applicable or the acceptable to the Western, especially Anglo-Saxon, the American style, the university. But in developing countries, especially in Asia, many the people do not want to adopt that kinds of policy. People want to have more the transparent procedures, not based on the parents' achievement, but based on the students' achievement. So that kinds of ethical rule would be necessary to reduce the corruption in education.
Thank you. Thank you for interesting response. This question is for all speakers. Are there the best policies which have been proposed in your field, and has there been an impact evaluation? Maybe Professor Narag?
Okay, I'm thinking of the best practices in the field that have been implemented. There are efforts to implement treatment programs that could be offered for drug offenders or persons who use drugs. And most of these treatment programs would, of course, look at onto their levels of addiction, what are the causes why they use drugs, and how they would overcome drug use behaviors. And some of these programs would include what we call cognitive behavioral therapy, challenging their justifications to use drugs. Because first, it is embedded into their thinking. Oh, it's okay to use drugs. Why? Because it's work. Oh, it's okay to use drugs. Why? It's because of boredom or lack of alternative recreation, right? And so you need to challenge those criminal thinking, those criminogenic thinking that leads them to drug use. And once those are challenged, of course, you need to provide alternatives for employment, alternatives for recreation, and so on and so forth. And what they found is that cognitive behavioral therapy programs that specifically address the reasons for offending are more likely to reduce recidivism. They are more likely to reduce failure to appear in courts, and they are more likely to increase the quality of life of these drug participants. They are more likely to go back to work, and they are likely to rejoin their families and their communities. And there have been efforts to introduce this. It's harm reduction approach. Instead of putting them to jail and prisons, then you reduce the harm instead, so that they would not go on to this life cycle. Again, the problem is, despite the evidence that these type of alternatives to incarceration do work, sometimes still, goes to the wayside. It's not being adopted and utilized by policymakers because of the problems of penal populism, the belief that incarceration is still the key. And the next step, therefore, is to continually documenting these best practices and sharing it to different jurisdictions until they get adopted.
Thank you. Any speakers add any answer? Maybe this one is, oh yeah, go ahead.
I was only going to give a very general comment to that, because I think best practice in counter trafficking is not something that can apply across the board. It really is specific to each country, because what might be a good practice in one country is a disaster in another if it's not calibrated to context. But I think to speak very generally, particularly from a criminal justice approach, I think good practice in counter trafficking looks like prioritization of trafficking cases that involve serious organized crime that really have a disruptive effect and a high value. And then from a prevention point of view, I think a key good practice that applies across the globe, including in our region here, is recognition that trafficking in persons cannot be prevented by a criminal justice approach alone, but also has to look at the implications of migration and labor law and policy on exacerbating vulnerability to trafficking and fueling a demand for exploitation. Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe we thank you very much. There are some other questions, but the time is running out now, so we have to conclude this session. Today, I am very honored and delighted that we were joined by Dr. McAdam, Professor Narag, Professor Go across the 3 different time zones. They shared with us their insight on the challenges for Asia and the Pacific and the relevant data collection for evidence-based policymaking. We are very grateful for the expertise and breadth of personal and professional experience shared with us today. One of the key takeaways has been the importance of collaboration, not just at the local or state level, but at the regional and global levels, because crime does not recognize borders. Similarly, the breadth of stakeholders involved, not just government agencies, but research institutes, academia, and civil society. Ultimately, the expertise are available, but the data is not. Asia and the Pacific has significantly challenges, but it is very important that we work together and exchange best practices, challenges, and solutions. Collaboration, cooperation, and coordination is the best keyword. I would like to use this opportunity for a few announcements for our center. Tomorrow, Wednesday, 16 June, Dr. Kwak from Chungnam National University is hosting the session on crime statistics for evidence-based policymaking at 8 a.m. Mexico City, 8 p.m. Bangkok, and 10 p.m. Seoul. We have a regional training on measuring SDG 16 in Asia from September to October. Every Thursday, 7 weeks maybe, and e-learning course on crime statistics from a gender perspective in November. Finally, I would like to thank our excellent speakers, listeners, and stakeholders for contributing to this session. Let me also thank our colleagues from UNODC headquarters, COE Mexico, and Korea colleagues who have worked closely with us to make this conference a success. Let's look forward to seeing again in next conference, and hopefully we will be able to meet then in person. Thank you, and I wish you all keep safe and well. Let me turn it over to Jose to wrap up. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Hyun Jung Park. Sin duda resulta necesario y propone un reto conjuntar y coordinar esfuerzos en 56 países y territorios de Asia y el Pacífico para generar datos que mejoren la toma de decisiones y las políticas basadas en evidencia, por lo cual de nuevo agradecemos a la participación de los ponentes, de la señora Hyun Jung Park, y a todas y a todos por acompañarnos en esta sesión. Nuevamente mis colegas compartirán en el chat una liga y un código para que nos ayuden a evaluar la sesión, así como registrar su asistencia a la misma. Les recordamos que para obtener el certificado de participación, deberán asistir por lo menos a 60% de las sesiones. Por eso es muy importante que nos regalen unos pocos minutos de su tiempo para contestarla. Les esperamos en la sesión Datos para Vidas Mejores, en punto de las 9:45, Ciudad de México. Muchas gracias a los panelistas, muchas gracias por acompañarnos y los esperamos en la siguiente sesión. Hasta luego.